Hey guys, welcome to the Behind the Seams podcast. I'm Nunzio Signore, and I'm really psyched today to be talking to Graeme Lehman. Graeme hails from Kimberley, British Columbia, and holds a Master of Science degree in Kinesiology from Memorial University. He's a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the NSCA, and his thesis paper on the correlation of throwing velocity to the results of lower body field tests in male college baseball players has been a go-to, not only for myself, but many other strength and conditioning coaches. He's a phenomenal resource and has a great ability to dive into concepts that are essentially derived from scientific research papers and studies, and he simplifies them in order to be a more easily digestible format for coaches and players. This is a big part of his pitcher's profile, which we'll be speaking about today, due to the fact that it doesn't really require any high-tech equipment in order to gain a better understanding and apply concepts when training to become more efficient athletes. Today, we'll sit down and we'll talk about everything from anthropometrics to coaching, some training tips for coaches, even without the hundreds of dollars in tools and equipment. We'll also talk about the direct correlation between his lateral jump testing of pitchers and the pitcher's future velocity based off of this test. He's been a consultant as well as a go-to resource for the MLB, as well as coaches, myself actually being one of them, and was named as one of Brent Strom's go-to experts in the industry. So today, I'd like to welcome to the podcast, Graeme Lehman. Graeme, thanks for being on, man.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. This is great. I'm looking forward to it.
You know, a lot of people, they want to hear me talk to pitching coaches. They want to hear me talk to recruiters. And I understand that. But some of the big players in the game, to me, as a guy who owns a private sector facility and consults with MLB teams as well, is the ability to change the athlete, the ability to give the athlete what he needs. And even as much as 8-9 years ago, I remember reading some of your stuff and I was like, you know what? I see eye to eye with this guy. And I've been following you through the years. I love what you do. And I was really excited to talk to you about today about your pitcher's profile, because I think it's a great resource for people. First off, in your thesis paper, you clearly demonstrated how power is plane specific. How did you even decide to choose this topic for your research study?
Well, yeah, at the time I was a young strength and conditioning coach, and I was enamored with like Eric Cressy kind of opened up the doors to be kind of like, okay, there's a future in this strength and conditioning as it relates to baseball. So I was lucky enough when I did my master's degree, I had a great supervisor, Dr. David Bayham, who let me kind of pick my own thesis. So as a strength coach wanting to improve baseball players, I wanted to basically find out like what athletic attributes contribute most to throwing velocity. Because if you're ever on a pitching staff or on a baseball team, it's like the guys in the pitching staff generally aren't the fastest runners or the highest jumpers and stuff like that, yet they throw the hardest. So what I set out to do was to do every athletic based field test I could think of that didn't require like a huge lab setup, and then measure their throwing velocity. So I was lucky enough to get, like, there's only really two legitimate kind of like baseball schools in Canada that play down in the States. So that's I was out in Vancouver at the time. So the University of British Columbia, like they're a high level NAI school, and then Douglas College, who plays like they're a junior college. So I got both of those teams. So roughly like 50, 60 subjects, and had them go through everything you could think of. I mean, medicine ball throws, forwards, backwards, 60-yard dash, 10-yard dash, jumping vertically off both legs, off one leg. And the lateral test, to be honest, Nunzio, was kind of like a little afterthought of like, I need to add another test. I need to kind of have something in a different plane of motion. And it was kind of one that I kind of threw in there. So I did all this stuff, gathered all the information. I remember it was a crazy day getting that much information for that many athletes. And then when I sat down with my stats guy who sort of helped me out, he said that this one particular test, he's like, what's this one? This is the one that clearly above and beyond all the other ones, this is the one that shows the highest correlation to throwing velocity. So, I mean, that's really what kind of made it jump out. But I mean, in a lot of cases, kind of the research is kind of following what good coaches are already doing. So yeah, luckily, I mean, that one correlated well with it. I mean, a couple others was like body weight, like a lot of other ones. And actually a backwards medicine ball throw was kind of like the third best correlator out of all the tests that I did. So it was interesting.
When I read that, I actually started using a force plate and a jump mat. And I tried to take that one step further. And I agree with you on the mass. I started combining the two to not only judge power in the frontal plane by combining the weight and the distance, but I also learned a lot about how well an athlete can decelerate and elasticity of the athlete off of a box drop height. So I took your lateral power testing and I started using it as, I call it a lateral RSI. It's instead of a depth drop jump, I used a lateral depth drop jump.
I remember reading about it.
And I went to Division I schools and I based it all off of the research that I was reading off of your paper. And then I went around to Palooza and different places speaking about the lateral RSI, and it was a big hit, and I still use it today in programming. So let's talk about the pitcher's profile. What exactly is your pitcher's profile? Why do you feel it can be a great tool to be used by coaches?
Yeah, so the profile, I mean, it's something like if you ever play a video game with sort of the avatar of kind of like maybe a race car, or again, I use a race car analogy quite a bit, where if you're picking a race car in a video game, sometimes it has a profile like, hey, this car accelerates really well. It kind of gives you a little numerical kind of idea of like, okay, how fast is this one in the corners? Does it accelerate well? What's its top end speed? And I don't know, I always liked that idea, because I mean, without me knowing much about the game or a car, I mean, from at a glance, I can get a quick idea of what this car's capabilities are. And it gives me, the user, an idea like, okay, like if I'm going into this kind of racetrack, maybe I want a car that has these types of abilities in it. So it just kind of spits out something of it quantifies in a really quick way of like, here's the abilities that this car has. And it puts it in a very sort of objective manner. Okay, here's all the data on it, and at a glance I can get a lot of information about something without kind of digging into it. So as a strength coach / pitching coach, I kind of wanted to create something as well where I could, even if I was just a strength coach, I want to sort of see what athletic attributes my athlete has, whether it's a baseball player, hockey player, you name it. Like, how are they from an endurance standpoint? How are they from an elasticity standpoint, mobility, absolute strength? I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole on all sorts of athletic abilities, but I just wanted to create something relatively simple that any coach or even player can kind of look at, and it gives you, again, a lot of quantitative and objective data at a glance that anybody can look at to sort of see how you compare against your peers. And it's realistically, it's just it's aimed at just being a tool where, again, it's not going to tell you how to pitch or exactly what to do in the weight room, but if this tool is put in the right hands of someone who is qualified and knows what to do, then it leads them down a path that's maybe a bit more efficient. We don't have to spend as much time in areas that we don't need to. Like, we really want to keep working on our strengths, but we got to make sure that if there's an area of weakness that we can play around with it. But going back to that gears analogy, I mean, I just think of pitching as kind of this. I mean, we start from a complete stationary stop when we have to come set. So I mean, that's gear 0, and then when we get going and ultimately to get to ball release, I mean, that's our 5th gear, 6th gear, whatever kind of sports car we're talking about here. But we need to have those different abilities. I mean, everyone has a first gear, whether it's a good first gear or not is up to that athlete. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like, by the time you get to ball release, like, how fast are you going? Some guys make up for that by having, let's say they don't have a good first or second gear, so they're not quite, quote unquote, strong, as we would define it as in the weight room. So maybe they don't have a good first and second gear, but as we get going through the delivery, maybe they're really good at the parts that require a lot more speed. So by the time the ball release, we can still be throwing 95 miles an hour, even if we don't have a really good first gear. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we could have a guy who's, again, really weight room strong, but maybe doesn't have the most mobility or whatever. But again, those guys can still throw really hard, but they rely more on that first gear kind of low torque sort of strength, like the kind of strength that you would use in a deadlift. Whereas another athlete could have more of the speed and power. They do well with like how fast they can throw a medicine ball. So I've just really found in my research kind of, and watching baseball, seeing how the huge variety of body types that we see. I just did a little analysis of all the pitchers on 40-man rosters. And I mean, the heaviest guy was 285 and the lightest guy was 155. The tallest guy was like, there's a height difference of 16 inches between the tallest guy listed and the shortest guy. So I just find that because there's such a wide variety, like we have to have something that can show us like what these athletes can and can't do, and get an idea of like, again, how does this particular athlete, what's their recipe to create velocity?
Those 16 inches, those differences in 16 inches, and that difference in 120 pounds or 130 pounds, they all throw hard.
They do,
So
right?
yeah, so
I just
obviously,
can't think of I can't think of another sport or another position in any sport where you're going to see such a wide variety. And I think it comes down to like throwing is such a primal thing. I mean, we've been doing it since our caveman era. So like everyone has this ability to throw, and it's just again how we get there. So there just can't be any one size fits all sort of approach, whether it's in the weight room or even just delivering mechanics. And that's really what I'm trying to go. This is this huge rabbit hole that I'm down. I released an ebook that's like 180 pages of exploring every single physical and athletic attribute, and just taking these deep dives to sort of, again, there has to be different ways. Like we're all going at the same end result of trying to throw 95 miles an hour, but there's just different ways to get there. So that's kind of what this profile is trying to do, is trying to just give you a little bit of a roadmap. Okay, here's how you are, and if you fit this particular model, again, if whether you're a sort of a fast twitch mobility kind of guy, like okay, that's fine, but like follow this kind of profile, and you don't have to become the guy that's gonna be the strongest trap bar lifter on your in a pitching staff, right? Like yes, we want you to be strong enough, but we don't have to kind of keep going down that road. It's not going to provide the best end result. So even if we really knew exactly how strong we needed it to be, like it's going to differ from different body types and everything like that. So
just giving the listeners a 3,000-foot view really quickly, this profile that Graeme has created is basically a series of tests that you can do, and it is blocked out into four categories, which we're going to talk about next: anthropometrics, mobility, strength, and speed. And the tests are all grouped into one of these four categories. And basically what this does is this allows you to do all the testing and find the lowest hanging fruit off of your athlete, okay? It's a brilliant way to do things. I love the way you break down the classic formula for work by inserting the four athletic abilities and physical traits into your profile. So like we have, force times time is work equals work, right? So you broke down force. What creates force? Well, strength and speed, right? So your strength and speed categories will handle the force side of that equation. The amount of time that you can apply that force has a lot to do with lever arms, how long these levers are that these guys have, which is the anthropometrics category, and how long they're able to create that force for. How long can they hold those successful positions, which is their mobility. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I want to talk about a little bit about each of those four categories, or the ingredients like you call them in your profile, starting with anthropometrics. Can you talk about what anthropometrics actually are and why they play such a huge role in creating programs and individualizing pitchers' mechanics?
yeah, I mean, and the anthropometrics, like I feel like they're kind of the least known, and I mean, I wish I would know more about them, and I think there's going to be some more research kind of coming out. But I mean, right now all we do from anthropometrics is look at height and weight, and that doesn't really tell a big story. So I mean, we can simply add in like arm length, how tall are you when you're sitting down versus standing up, so like torso length, how long is your shin in relation to your femur. So there's a million different things to kind of look at, and the reason I think it's important is because it's the frame of your body, and it's the one thing that we can't change once we reach maturity, obviously. But I mean, again, if someone's not that strong, we know how to make that better. If someone's not that mobile, we know how to make that better, but we're not stretching bones or anything like that. So knowing, I think it's kind of the first step of kind of, if we go back to that car analogy, let's say we have like a frame of a vehicle. That's what we're kind of starting with, and then we know, okay, based on what this frame looks like, we can get an idea of like, okay, here's how much suspension we need or how much horsepower we need to sort of take advantage of this particular frame. And so I think it's just really important. I mean, if we look at the term biomechanics, I mean, the mechanics component of it is like this human machine that we're looking at, and if we don't kind of look at the actual measurements of that body aside from height and weight, then we're leaving a lot of stuff on the table, right? So I mean, we all know what it kind of looks like, and I wish I knew more answers. And again, when I write these blogs and I write this little ebook and stuff like that, it's almost my way of learning, of where I write the stuff down, and every time I write something down and try to provide one answer, hopefully I come up with
There's
one or two
another
more
aha
questions.
moment that happens. Yeah,
exactly, right. And but I think it's absolutely huge. I mean, I think, again, without me knowing and running research articles, I think like that forearm length is a huge component. I mean, that's kind of like that last whip of the lever
yes.
that we have. But again, and then maybe having wider shoulders and a narrow waist. Maybe that could be like, okay, this athlete really needs to have like we need some hip shoulder separation, but it needs to be fast and quick. Whereas guys with like longer torsos, maybe that loading kind of component between the hips and shoulders takes a longer period of time to happen. Again, I wish I knew these answers, but I'm just trying to, again, ask these questions so that I can try to learn them better, but then hopefully other researchers actually have the ability to kind of measure this stuff can, right?
I think one of the important things that you said is that the anthropometrics, okay, we come in and we assess guys, and in the private sector or in any kind of training, you have a problem. You do, I call it like a blood panel. You look at the blood panel, you see what's in range and what's out of range. And then you work to get those back in range or back the ones that are out of range back in range. With anthropometrics, you can't really do that. So there's nothing we can really do. We have to deal with them. And I think from my experience, with taller guys, I think a big part of what happens is there's really a lot that can be done as far as back leg loading goes. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And I really think that what happens there is, you're setting yourself up all the way down through your mechanics. It's a thing that happens first. It's the thing that happens slowest. It's the thing that for me always seems to be the easiest to correct. And it's your first gear. You can either hit the ground running or you can start from behind the line, and nobody really wants to do that. So I think that from an anthropometric standpoint, looking at that torso length to see how we can better load the back leg, looking at their leg length to see how they have to load that back leg as far as shin angles go. We'll talk about all that stuff, but I think that my biggest takeaway from doing this is that I personally needed to do more anthropometrical stuff. So that was my big aha moment years ago when I was reading about your profile, because this profile, you've been working on this for a really long time.
Yeah, it has been a while for sure.
The second category is mobility. Please talk about the importance of mobility and some of the big players mobility-wise that you assess in the profile.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of work recently of again, looking at mobility has always been important, but using mobility to kind of dictate how we should pitch. I mean, looking at hip internal and external rotation has been huge in terms of like how we need to load that back leg. But again, looking at someone's even just shoulder external rotation, again, not everybody needs to have like these crazy amounts of external rotation, but that if you do that, that's phenomenal. And again, it gives you more time to create that power. But I mean, I bet you there's some of like our bigger pitchers out there that look like football linebackers. They might not have as much external rotation, but they have the strength and power to develop that same amount of speed, but in a more abbreviated time frame, right? So I mean, mobility we've always looked at just from a pure injury prevention kind of standpoint. But I mean, when I do this profile, and if a high school coach or college coach is going to do it with their kids, I didn't want it to make it like, okay, we're not doing these measurements to try to diagnose any type of injury restrictions or future injuries and stuff like that, but is just to get a slight idea of, is this person classified as being sort of mobile or not so mobile? So when I put the profile together, again, it's aimed at people that don't have a ton of either equipment or maybe a lot of expertise. So again, there's a lot of ways we can kind of look at it, and mobility in itself is kind of tough to measure accurately. Again, if you and I were trained the exact same way how to measure hip internal and external rotation, we could get slightly different measurements. So again, it's just to kind of give a bit of an overview of, again, is this person mobile or not? I mean, again, you could definitely use it to try to still improve, but it's probably the toughest one to quantify, especially if we're going to do it accurately. But again, we just want to get a general idea of is this athlete pretty mobile or are they tight?
Yeah, and I think that looking at, does a guy have a lot of ER? I think a lot of times when I look on social media, I see everyone's trying to produce the same picture. They're looking at, okay, you need to sit back. You need to have a nice vertical shin. That vertical shin does not work with a guy who does not have the external rotation to hold that. You know what I mean? Maybe this guy needs to come down maybe with a little bit more IR, hold IR. Maybe this is a guy who needs to land a little bit closed. Closed isn't always so bad if you can't open up. I mean,
100%, right? And we just can't force mechanics on someone who can't move in a certain way. I mean, the Tim Lincecum era was a good example of that. Someone who could get way out there, super freakish, and I mean, it probably ruined a lot of kids' careers by trying to sort of mimic that. But again, you just don't have those abilities, right? I mean, I'm trying to think of a quote from a sort of a track and field coach that I was reading about. But I mean, the basis of it is like you should want to have your athlete like have the largest range of motion possible to create more power. But I mean, at the end of the day, you can only use whatever that athlete has. I mean, the same thing happens in the golf world where people try to get this huge shoulder turn, but again, if their bodies just can't do that, it's not going to end well.
Lower back pain.
Yeah, we're just trying to customize. Like I think like coaching has come a long ways, but us as coaches, we're the ones that need to adapt to the athlete in front of us. I need to adapt my whether it's in the weight room or on the mound, I need to adapt my cues in my training program to fit that athlete based on what they can do in front of me. Sure, I want to make improvements, but I can't just have this like one size fits all. Like here's how we throw and here's how we lift. And sure, that'll work for whatever, maybe 50% of those athletes that sort of fit in the middle. But there's going to be athletes at either end of the spectrum that program doesn't work for. And if your job as a coach is to try to develop and move as many kids on as possible, you just want to increase those odds. So you got to have somewhat of a program that's adaptable. So I need to have exercises and drills that are adapted to athletes that are either on the super mobile end of the spectrum, and then ones that are sort of on the tighter end of the spectrum. And that's true for all the other categories that we're going to talk about.
A lot of guys come in there, they have super, super long hamstrings. You know what I mean? That's the reason that they're tight. They feel like their hamstrings are tight and they start stretching their hamstrings. Well, they're stretching something, a spring can be tight because it's short and thick, and a hamstring can be tight because it's like a ballpoint pen and it's thin and long and it gets tight at the end. So a guy that's got a lot of laxity, who has long hamstrings because they're being overworked because he's not using his glutes, and then you see tight hamstrings and you think that you're going to just give this guy extra mobility. So it's really important to find out, not only are these guys mobile, and are you confusing tightness with someone who maybe is too loose? And that's why he's actually tight. We need to actually, instead of focusing on trying to stretch something that's already tight, maybe we need to activate the glutes so we can take some of the stress off the hamstring. Do you understand?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, with that specific example, like again, more the people in the sort of physical therapy sort of realm, like they would talk about like that pelvis is probably anterior tilted, so like your hamstring's already in a lengthened position because we're dumping forward. So stretching those hamstrings, like that tightness is there as a protective mechanism, and we don't really want to take that away. And then there's other athletes, like some of the best track and field sprinters in the world have been quote unquote tight, but I mean that's what makes them good, is that stiff springiness. When we get to kind of the elasticity chat, is again, we just want to be kind of within a range. And again, we know, again, some pitchers live and die off of like their ability to produce like 100, like their forearm in that layback position is like almost past that 180 degrees position because they're going down the mound. But again, you're going to get guys that are just super strong that they don't need to have that much time and in that layback position to produce that type of power. Sorry. I think we always, in this industry, we look at the most extremes, like, hey, this pitcher can deadlift 600 pounds, so I'm going to try to do that. Or this pitcher's got like the most extreme, crazy amount of external rotation. And we just can't be good at kind of everything in that realm without sacrificing something. So again, it's just, the profile, again, it's just there to kind of measure where you are. Again, we want to make improvements in certain areas, but again, it's just show kind of what athlete we have in front of us today.
So the next category is strength. I know this is due to the fact that your profile is geared to situations that may not have access to a weight room. So it seems that testing is really testing strength speed. For those of you who do not have access to a weight room, how would you adjust testing protocols, and what tests would you add if I'm assuming the big three, like if you could test strength, and you do have a weight room, and you do have bar speed, and you do have velocity-based stuff, you would basically test the big three?
I mean, yeah, I would definitely use some bar speed to look at. I mean, I'm just not a fan of like the 1 rep max. So get an appreciable amount of weight on the bar and sort of see how fast they can move it. So, I mean, we don't have to test max strength, but I would definitely I would like to see strength speed kind of in between those. So again, like what's your 80% max on your trap bar deadlift and how fast can you move it? But the exercises that I selected, I guess a lot of the stuff in the profile is more about like, what I would call strength, or what I categorize as strength, is kind of like looking at even stuff like broad jump power. So I'm not looking at what your broad jump distance was, but like how much power you're producing. So I kind of just classify stuff as either being kind of like more towards the force or strength end of the spectrum versus at the speed. And I feel like those types of things, like I don't want to take the weight room out of the equation, but like those are the types of things, like the reason I'm doing deadlifts and squats and rear foot elevated split squats and stuff like that is to kind of improve the performance on those. So if I keep testing the broad jump or medicine ball throws that we'll chat about, like in order to improve those, I know that the only way to improve those is to actually get stronger, sort of in the weight room, right? So again, it's just like I talked about with mobility, where it's just really tough to quantify like what a good lift is. Like, again, we've all seen really bad squats and we've seen good ones, but for me to test a back squat, like there's just so many kind of other factors that we need to take into account of like what you and I would consider to be a good squat or whatever, right? So I just want to, I would maybe use like kind of like with my athletes, I try to use like some standards of like, okay, I want you to be able to, if you can squat this weight well for like 8 times, and that's great. Let's pick a heavier weight next time and kind of keep going up. Like, and we're just using it to progressively overload. I just don't want to make that the ultimate focus in the weight room. But again, if you have a skilled strength and conditioning coach who does that, and if the athletes have experience knowing how to do the lifts, then I'm all for it, especially with the velocity based stuff to create like a real profile.
Yeah, the velocity based stuff is great because you can do that 8 rep, and that will give you a 1 rep max, an estimated 1 rep max. I've been using it for years. I only take guys up to about 70% of what their estimated 1 rep max should be. So if you're looking at a guy that's maybe lacking a lot of strength, I can still get an estimate of his 1 rep max if I only bring him up to 70%. The deceleration portion of that lift goes way down once we start lifting over 60%. So I take them up to about 70%. What I wanted to mention about this profile is really, really effective to me for my guys that are 17 and older, because I think that strength already has reached a position and a lot of their growing is done. So I think that this profile really helps pick out the nuts and bolts of guys that are like juniors, seniors in high school, college, pro guys. You know what I mean? Those younger guys, I'm just under the impression that I need to get guys at 13, 14, 15 years old. I just need to get them strong right now. I'm not really worried about their anthropometrics or their deceleration abilities. I think we need to get them strong. So I want the public to know that's listening to this podcast, with these young guys, it's great to test these guys on stuff, but it is under and correct me if you disagree with me, Graeme, it's under my impression that all of these metrics will get better as a kid just gets older and gets stronger. And then once we start to figure out what strong enough is, these things really start to come into play.
No, I 100% agree with you. I would say, I don't mind doing like these profiles because they don't have any weight training with so I don't mind using them with like the 13, 14, 15-year-olds of the world. Right. But what I think it does, if you do that, is to kind of give an idea of, here's where you are today, and here's what a profile looks like of a guy that did go Division 1 or Division 2 or junior college or NAI or something like that. It just kind of gives us a bit of a roadmap of like, here's where you are today, and if you want to get to like pick your target, and here's how to get there. Because when I was young and growing up or whatever, like everyone was told you got to get stronger in the weight room, but there was no kind of no real end target of just like, yeah, get stronger, but that's pretty vague, or get bigger, whatever. But if you have that kind of real roadmap painted out in front of you, and then as professionals like you and I are, like it's our job to sort of guide that athlete from their point A to their point B in kind of the most effective and efficient way possible. And that profile is just something that you can kind of revisit once in a while. It's fun. Especially if you're comparing yourself with your peers a little bit. You can use it as a bit of a competitive thing. Coaches can use it to sort of rank guys in terms of who's their fastest, who's their strongest. But it's really geared towards of just being something that you as an athlete can kind of look at periodically. You don't have to test yourself every week or whatever, but if you did that twice a year or something like that, you just sort of see how you're progressing, and again, looking for the biggest areas of opportunity to take advantage of it.
And I think that in that strength portion, because you're looking at power in broad jump, in the lateral jump, the static jump, I think that when you need to work on that portion of those moves, I think that strength training will improve those moves probably the most. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Which brings us to speed. Can you please talk about speed a little bit, and how you analyze it in the profile, and where does that enter into where we are gear wise and in the delivery?
Yeah, so I mean, speed is obviously we're just moving faster. I mean, our sport of choice is like as fast as it possibly gets. So we're trying to move a 5 ounce baseball, which is very light. We're trying to move it as fast as possible. So we need that athleticism to 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 do that, right? So a lot of the tests that I put in the profile, like it's you're actually not even doing that many tests, but so look at broad jump, for example, like the broad jump score of like how far you went, that would I would categorize, I classify that as providing us a bit of a speed score. Whereas if I take your body weight into consideration, that kind of gives us a bit of a strength one. So we're all going to have like look at these athletes that are like super fast, like the maybe if they don't pitch, like they play up the middle because they're really fast. They're playing center field, so I can see if an athlete can just run really fast, but you might get another type of pitcher who a big kid who doesn't run that fast, but when you take a body weight in consideration, that kind of classifies him as being sort of stronger. So now we're kind of looking at like maybe relative strength versus absolute strength. And ideally we have an athlete who can be good at both. But if you really want to specialize in one thing, like again, we got to be pretty fast. So this is where I'm looking at more, yeah, like your normal jump scores. And if I were to elaborate on this profile, like I would look at like drop jump scores, like how good are you using elasticity and looking at those kind of things. So again, I think that as we start to move down the gears, I guess, or up the gears towards like that fifth gear where we're moving really quick, I think stuff like looking at even like a 30-yard or 30-meter dash up here, that performance and your ability to sprint, like that correlates a little bit more with like the action of like the front leg. I just recently wrote some articles on this one research study where they looked at like ratios between the 10-yard dash and like the 30-yard dash, where they measured like the time it took from like so they looked at the first 10 meters, they scored that, and then they looked at the speed from the 10-meter all the way to the 30-meter, so basically like a flying 20 start. And they actually found that for just the pitchers group, like the guys who were better in like the second half of that sprint, or I guess the like from the 10 meters on, like if you had a good flying start, if you had a good 20 meters at the end, that meant that those guys typically threw a little bit harder, because again, we need that sort of speed, because again, when that front leg hits the ground, it's very sort of elastic. It's a tremendous amount of force coming in, and it's oftentimes the rate limiting factor. But if we only did sort of really heavy but slow sort of rear foot elevated split squats on that front leg, that's not as specific as what we need it to be. So I mean, again, because pitching starts from a static position and then ends with a very fast action, I just think, again, we need to be kind of good at everything along that force velocity curve. I mean, we need the trap bar deadlifts to get good at that first gear strength, and we need some sprinting actions to get really good at the faster sort of movements. And again, you don't have to be the best in the world at either one, but you definitely need to have, like, you need to cover your bases, so to speak.
So that's interesting, because I was going to bring up right before you talked about the 30, we do a test where we take a 20-yard dash and we look at the 10-yard split. You input height and weight, and you take the final time, and then you take the split. And it can tell you, based off of the first 10 and the second 10, a lot of it can tell you about a guy's top end speed, which you're talking about, and whether he's good out of the hole, which is more of a strength based thing. And you can kind of adjust programming off of that. And you were talking about the front leg. As far as deceleration capabilities, let's talk a little bit about the possible differences in cueing front foot landing, how you would take something that you see off of the profile between, say, a college and, say, a younger athlete who may not possess that same amount of strength.
Yeah, I mean, it's in my younger sort of pitching coach days, I sort of came up with I did a little webinar where I was trying to talk about front leg mechanics, and again, I was dealing with like a lot of sort of younger athletes who were sort of having that front leg sort of collapse on them. They weren't strong enough. So we know from some research, again, that from that front leg, from the time it hits the ground to the time our the ball's out of our hand, like the people who throw hard, that knee stays in that same amount of flexion, or it actually kind of extends, whereas like the slower throwing groups kind of collapses. So again, I found like a lot of kids were trying to like their landing was kind of too heavy. They didn't have the strength to do that. So I was kind of talking about kind of like landing sort of at an angle, kind of like landing like a how a plane would land versus a helicopter. And but it wasn't until I had like a conversation probably within the next couple months after that with Chris Holt, who's the pitching coach for the Baltimore Orioles, and he sort of is like, I gotta have to disagree with you a little bit. I like our guys to have like that bit of that landing where they are coming down on it, because again, if you have the strength and the ability to do it, like if you can land kind of coming from down from above,
Sure.
that's more potential energy that you could send up the chain, right? But I'll look at like stuff like drop jumps, like if you step off of like a say a 12-inch box, if you can hit the ground and jump up, like you should be able to jump higher dropping off of a box, because we have that more elasticity, potential energy stored. But eventually, if we kept climbing up the height of the box, if I made you go from a 12-inch to a 16 to an 18 to a 24, there's eventually going to be a point where you no longer have the strength to absorb and decelerate quick enough to kind of use that stretch shortening reset reflex
protective devices kick in.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, there gets to be a point where again, I can't jump off my roof and hit the ground and expect to jump 40 inches. You just don't have that decelerative strength. There gets to be that point where that amortization phase between the eccentric and the concentric, where it just lasts too long. Again, that amortization time period has to be absolutely super fast, and that's where like Cal Dietz's triphasic training. I mean, that was a big influence on me to kind of look at that. And we trained hockey guys like that for years, of kind of breaking training down into those three phases. But yeah, so if you don't have the strength to do it, because again, I think there's some research out of the University of Ohio with Dr. Jimmy Ornate, again, where they found like that front leg was just, again, it's the rate limiting factor, because we're coming down the mound, we're landing on 1 foot only. So again, if we don't have the strength, again, it just doesn't do any good. And that's where I feel almost like some of my research with the lateral, like the lateral jump powers plane specific type thing, like it hurt some kids in terms of like they were trying to push off the mound too far. Like again, we want to have as much power and momentum going towards the home plate as possible, but we can only, anything more than we can accept is actually going to play against us rather than play for us. So it's tough. I mean, to measure deceleration without lab equipment, sometimes I'll do pro agilities, and you really got to use your quote unquote coach's eye to sort of see how the athlete kind of comes
Stops
like in and out of those
Yeah.
turns. Again, same thing if I did a pro agility, but let's say I get like a 30-yard start before I had to change directions, like I can't be running at max speed and expect to change directions very well. Like there has to be, ideally we want to be able to stop and start.
Using a jump mat in the frontal plane, like in a box drop hiding, exactly what you're saying to do and how quickly they can get off that mat tells us a lot about their decelerative abilities.
Yeah.
Looking for under 250 milliseconds, is something that we do. Once again, that's using gear though. That's using equipment. Looking at their height, that's great. It's like, it still works. Last thing I want to talk about is let's give the guys an example of putting this all together. Let's give them an example how we'll use this profile to address, say, back leg mechanic. How can we look at anthropometrics to see how much a pitcher may need to lean over for his ability to put force into the back leg? And let's also look at how quickly they should load that back leg.
I emphasize a lot about the back leg because it's the first thing that happens. It's the slowest, so athletes have the best chance of actually making adjustments. And then, to be honest, like after that back leg loads and unloads, like it's tough to coach from there on. We just want everything to sort of
it's too fast
to unravel, right? So it's too much to think about. But I mean, the torso angle stuff, I mean, I got that more kind of from just looking at like my day job, I guess, as a strength and conditioning coach, of looking at different setups for people. Again, if you got like if someone has short femurs and a long torso, they're going to squat a bit differently than someone who has kind of the opposite, right? I mean, and if we look at, so I've always tried to look at stuff outside of baseball as well. Like I study a lot of baseball research, but I've looked at everything from cricket to water polo and then obviously weight training of just how it happens. So I feel that if someone has like, especially like a long torso, the thing I'm big on lately is I think I've heard it from Lance Wheeler, is like when we're going down the mound, we kind of want to have our butt kind of behind us as we're going down the mound. And if I've got a really long torso, and if my hips are kind of behind this midline kind of going down towards the mound, if I have a long torso, I almost have to kind of lean my upper body forward in order to kind of compensate for that. I need that sort of counterweight. If I try to keep a vertical torso and try to lean my hips back as I'm going down the mound, I'm just like, my direction's going to be off, and I just don't have that ability to do that. Whereas someone who has maybe shorter femurs and even a shorter torso, like they can sort of stay sort of a bit more upright. Sort of in that final chapter, I used James Paxton, Canadian pitcher, but again, pretty long torso, or he's got to kind of be really kind of leaning forward. And I think I contrasted him with Noah Syndergaard. Like, I didn't measure these guys. I've never had the opportunity to measure these guys, but just even off of like a screen, you can just tell like they're a little bit different. So Syndergaard was able to kind of be a bit more upright, even if they're sitting back to the same amount. Like, his torso is a bit more upright. Whereas again, if you have a longer torso, then you just have to kind of be leaning forward. Otherwise, again, you need that counterweight. So again, I wish I knew all the answers of exact ratios and stuff like that. But again, I'm just trying to like ask these questions and try to get other people's input into it as well.
There's a lot of really usable stuff for coaches to look at.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I hope lots of people do use it and come up with their own answers, and please share it back. But in terms of like the loading speed of that back leg, again, we know we need to kind of load up. I mean, the amount of kind of rotation that happens, that would be a bit more like, again, looking at that profile again, what kind of hip internal external rotation do we have, the speed at which it loads up. I feel like, again, that relates more, again, if we were doing like a force profiling on someone, and like with what you do with the velocity based training, again, if someone's phenomenal at sort of that slower low gear sort of strength, I feel like that back leg loading has to happen at a slower pace, right? Whereas guys that are more sort of on that on the elasticity, more on the fast speed end of the spectrum, that load has to happen, but it has to happen at sort of at a quicker rate. So like they're sort of drifting, they're already going down the mound, and then like that leg kind of loads and unloads kind of as they're going down. Whereas you can see some other pitchers kind of really sit back into that hip sort of early on, right? I wrote a big one about that years ago, and I think I used Matt Bush, he's only like 5'9", one of the most athletic guys. You'd love to see him in the weight room because he's going to be strong. He was a real sort of sit back, sort of slow, but slow doesn't necessarily mean not fast, but again, a slow but strong sort of load up. And then the other guy I contrasted him with, I think it was Tony Bennett, I think, who's with the Rangers, but he was very tall, and he was a very pronounced like pop and go type of guy. So again, he may be the guy that you see him in the weight room. If you were just to see him at any public gym, you'd be like, that guy's a professional athlete. Like, he's barely lifting anything, but you give him like a bit of a run up to like a hurdle hop or something like that, and he'd be able to like fly over like a 50-inch hurdle or something like that, and you'd be like, wow, that's crazy athleticism.
Asking a guy with really long lever arms that doesn't have a lot of weight behind him and a lot of strength to hold his weight into his back leg that's almost torturous. He's going to leak everywhere. There's going to be, by the time he's ready to actually put force into the ground, it's going to be nothing there to put into the ground.
Yeah. I love, again, I'm a strength and conditioning coach for a bunch of sports, volleyball, basketball. So I do a lot of jumping stuff. And in the jumping world, they'll classify like slow jumpers versus fast jumpers. And again, like some guys can fly off of like a 1 foot, whereas other guys that are a bit more weight room meathead guys, like they really kind of like to come in for a two-step approach. And again, you can still dunk a basketball off either approach, but again, it's going to be, some athletes just do better off of one versus the other. So again, it's just trying to find what they're naturally kind of good at. And I mean, again, we still want to get the weak kids that are maybe really bouncy. We still want to get them strong, because I think it'll make them better, but we still got to do some of those real good sort of plyometric drills that they're good at. Like, we want to make our strengths, but we just got to bring up our weaknesses to a certain extent.
So have you thought about putting out something where once you use the profile, you can give suggestions of how people can train that as well? Because this profile looks like it's very geared towards the coach or the athlete who can actually do it, but then actually knowing what to do with those results. Is that something that maybe is next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, 100,000%. I mean, I always like these tools that we have. I always kind of use the analogy of like a thermostat versus a thermometer. I mean, even if someone had the force velocity profiling equipment that you had and stuff like that, like, it's cool to sort of see how much weight you can move a bar at a certain speed. But
but what do you do with
that? Like a thermometer, where it just gives you an accurate reading, whereas a thermostat gives you that accurate reading, and it also, it helps you make that adjustment of adding this or taking that away. So, I mean, it's like I said at the beginning, it's just a tool. and I'm looking at trying to kind of use it a bit more. Like I'm getting a bit more involved in baseball. Like right now, I live in the mountains in a small little town that doesn't have a ton of baseball, but I'm doing more and more sort of remote stuff and even sort of a hybrid of a remote position of like in person and remote with like a larger baseball organization. So I'm looking forward to kind of using this stuff myself a little bit more and just kind of fine tuning it. But yeah, it would probably be something of a bit more of like an educational process. I don't think I have the IT capabilities or the AI kind of stuff of like, okay, you enter your information from like these 15 different tests that I put in, and it's not going to spit out like a year-long
Right.
periodized program of like, do
Right.
this, that, and here's how you should be throwing and stuff like that. Again, that's more the art side of coaching. Whereas this profile is very scientific of like, here's where you are. And again, if you have that skill set of like knowing how to actually improve people, but I always find that athletes, again, we only have so much time and energy in a day, and its job is to just help us kind of go down the path that we're making the most out of this time and effort, because we can't just try to get good at everything. There's just not enough time in the day.
I got to tell you, it's a phenomenal concept. I've been actually doing profiling on pitchers. It's like you make a snowball, right? And then you keep tweaking it. And the more you tweak it, it gets harder and harder up to a certain point. I've been doing the same thing with my profiling, except I'm using the equipment that's in my facility. So when I looked at yours, I was like, this is really great. I got some great ideas from your profile. I still got some great things from this. I would highly recommend maybe some Division III schools that might not have a strength and conditioning coach, not big weight rooms. I would highly suggest that they look into Graeme's profile. Graeme, how can people reach you, and how can they get this profile?
Yeah, so if you go to my website, it's just lehmansbaseball.com. So LEHMANS baseball.com. It's up on the top sort of menu board of things to like. There's an about me, there's a testimonials, and there's this profiling thing. I'll try to pin it on my Twitter, which is also just at Lehman's Baseball.
Awesome. You guys can reach me at Nunzio Signori on Twitter. You can reach my facility at RPP_baseball on Twitter and Instagram. Website, rocklandpeakperformance.com. And I have a book out released by Human Kinetics called Velocity-Based Training, How to Apply Science, Technology, and Data to Maximize Performance. You can get that on Amazon. You can get it directly from Human Kinetics. We've been speaking with Graeme Lehman, really, really bright guy. Love talking to him. Graeme, thanks for being on the show. And
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, man. And we'll talk to you next time on Behind the Seams podcast.